Welcome to the Cold Case Christianity broadcast, the only Christian case-making program hosted by a cold case homicide detective. J. Warner Wallace has been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Court TV, and Dateline. For more information about Jim's work and the case for Christianity, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. Now, here's your host, J. Warner Wallace.
Welcome back to Cold Case Christianity. I'm J. Warner Wallace. Now, last week we started a four-part process, a four-step process, in examining the reliability of the eyewitness accounts in the Gospels in the New Testament. And this was a process that I actually went through piece by piece as I began to examine whether or not these accounts were actually historically reliable. And what I mean by that is this. As a new guy who was, I wasn't new when I was 35, I was older, but I was definitely somebody who was new to Christianity in the sense that I had a very cursory kind of, and if I'm honest with you, a more atheistic perspective on the Gospels, in the sense that I had never really examined them forensically or with an eye of a detective. I had been exposed to them as a young man, of course, and our culture is full of folks who are talking about the Bible at one point or another, and I rejected all these claims based first and foremost on the fact that they contain elements of the supernatural. And I was a committed philosophical naturalist. That would have, to me, as I heard the stories about miracles in the New Testament, as I heard the stories of the resurrection, I thought, look, like anybody else doing science, I would have never embraced a supernatural explanation in my scientific understanding of the world. Why would I embrace a supernatural perspective in my historical understanding of the world? As a matter of fact, I would have argued, like many scholars today argue, that the minute the supernatural enters into the discussion, the minute an ancient account includes something that is supernatural, well, you've got something that you've got to reclassify the account. You certainly can't consider it to be history. You'd have to consider it to be some form of mythology, wouldn't you? I mean, and that's always my view prior to doing what I did with the Gospels, which I've chronicled in the book Cold Case Christianity. The reason why I took this approach was because I was such a committed skeptic. And I still am about a lot of areas. You know, I think most people who know me would say I'm pretty skeptical about people still, and I'm more likely to test almost everybody with the same four-part process that we're using last week and this week to test the New Testament gospel authors. And so we started last week by talking about the questions that we typically would offer a jury, so that they can think about these things in their mind as they examine the claims of eyewitnesses on the stand. There are a number of questions in the state of California that we offer jurors to look at and to think about as they're listening to eyewitnesses. And they break into four large, broad categories, which I have tried to talk about last week and this week. The first two categories we talked about last week is really about whether or not we can be sure that the eyewitness was actually there to begin with. Because people will claim to see something when in fact it's not true. They want to help somebody, they want to be part of a big case, whatever the reason may be. You've got to test them to make sure they were actually there. So last week we spent some time talking about whether or not the Gospels were actually written early enough to have been written by eyewitnesses. And once you've locked down the early dating of the Gospels, this, of course, does not mean they're reliable. It's one of four legs to this table that have to be built in order to have anything stand on it. So the second piece, of course, we talked about last week also. We skipped around. The order I typically offer them is a little bit different when I'm in a presentation setting. But we offered the second piece, which I thought was related in my own skepticism, which is, has the story changed over time? It might be an early account, but if it's been altered several times across the stretch of history, then it really wouldn't matter how early it is, would it? You'd have to, be able to demonstrate that the account we have is identical, or is, if nothing else, you have to say point for point, is presenting the same Jesus that was presented in the first century by the people who knew Jesus best. We examined that last week to see, does the miraculous aspect of Jesus, does his nature as a miracle worker, or walking on water, or rising from the dead, are these late attributes of Jesus that emerge only after several variations of Jesus have been penned in the early centuries? Well, we talked about that last week, and you can see why now. The version of Jesus we have is really the very close. It's the identical Jesus we had in the first century. You're stuck. Now, can we verify every aspect of the Gospels and is every detail mentioned in the Gospels repeated by the students of the disciples? No. But I can tell you this, the elements that matter the most to us as Christians, whether or not Jesus was divine, whether he spoke these sermons and performed these miracles and died on a cross and rose from the grave and ascended into heaven, was born of a virgin, all these elements that we typically would argue are the most foundational to the nature of Jesus for those of us who believe as Christians, those are the same details that were offered to the original students of the eyewitness authors. And when you see their writings and these details are confirmed, you can have good confidence that you're heading in the right direction. At least this story is early and it hasn't changed. Now, there are two other aspects, though, that we want to have when we look at eyewitness reliability, and that is, first today we're going to talk about whether or not we have any reason to believe these are true by way of corroboration. Now, in this excerpt you're about to see from a presentation I did last year in Green Bay, I had a chance to kind of take a little more time with the audience and talk about what touchpoint corroboration is all about. But that's the first issue we're going to examine today. Do we believe that there's any external corroboration for the Gospels? Well, let's take a look at this part of the presentation, and you can get that answer for yourself as we talk about a couple of categories. One, archaeological verification, and two, the statements of non-Christians in the early centuries related to Jesus and the Christians. Let's take a look.
The only thing we're going to cover today is this one. Are they verified? Now, how do we verify something? Well, sometimes if a witness says something, I'll verify it by using some other piece of evidence. If I was to, let's say we had a bank robbery, you'll be my teller, okay? And you'll be my witness. And I came into the teller, I'm the bad guy, and I put my hand on, I said, give me all your money with a gun in my hands. And you saw that, and you told me that he came in and leaned over the counter, and he said, give me all your money. How could I verify that? What could I look for to verify that claim from the witness? Fingerprints. Where? On the counter. They better be in that direction, right? They better match what she says. If they do, I'll have corroborative evidence. But did you notice something? The fingerprints will tell me nothing about whether I had a gun. The fingerprints will tell me nothing about what I said. All corroborative evidence is touch point evidence. It gives you one small piece from which you infer the larger account. Make sense? That's important because we can do something with the scripture as well to look and see if there's any corroborative evidence. But remember, all corroborative evidence is touch point evidence. So instead of using fingerprints here, I think we can use archaeology to do just this work. And so if you'd have gone back 150 years and asked people to assess Luke's reliability, a lot of scholars would have said Luke is unreliable. He mentions things for which there are no outside support. I'll just give you a brief list of some of the things that were doubted either in Luke's gospel or in John's gospel by skeptics until in the last 100 years, we've now discovered the archaeology to support the claim. This happens all the time. People will have a skeptical doubt and we'll discover it in archaeology and put it to bed. And I could do this all day with you. I could go through one after the other pieces of archaeological support for things that Luke has written. There are volumes and two really good websites online that can help you find this kind of corroborative evidence. By the way, my Mormon family, and I take trips to Salt Lake City every year with the missions team. Do you think there's any archaeological support for the 1,000-year history from 600 BC to 400 AD that's mentioned in the Book of Mormon on this continent? Is there a single foundation, a single city, a single sword, a coin, a single name from the Book of Mormon that's inscribed anywhere on the continent? I don't expect to have every single detail from the Bible corroborated by archaeology, but I expect something. There's nothing for the Book of Mormon, not a single thing. You cannot write a volume of anything related to archaeology in the Book of Mormon. So as I was kind of examining this for the first time, these two books, simultaneously, the same stuff that gave me confidence in Scripture really destroyed my confidence in the Book of Mormon. We can have good confidence in this kind of touch point. But how about this? What if I caught the guy who did the robbery, right? And I interviewed him. And I said, hey, I know you did that robbery. I wasn't even in the bank. Dude, I got videotape of you in the bank. I don't really have that. I just tell him that. Okay, well, I was in the bank, but I wasn't doing a robbery. Well, you walked over and you wrote a demand note at that counter. No, I was writing a deposit slip. Oh, dude. Then you took the demand note over to the teller. You screamed at her, pointed a gun. No, I was just upset that I forgot my ID out in the car, so I went outside to get my ID. Now, has he actually confessed to doing a robbery in the bank? No. But will I use those statements against him in trial? Oh, yeah. because he's put himself at the time of the crime, at the scene of the crime, just trying to describe it a different way. These are reluctant admissions that I can use in trial. It turns out there are many first century reluctant admissions about Jesus. People who are not Christians, who don't believe in Jesus, but who will have to reluctantly admit certain facts in denying Jesus. Let me give you an example of this. Here's a guy named Thallus, who in the first century, he's writing and he's talking about the darkness that occurred at the crucifixion. And he denies that it's supernatural. He says it's just an eclipse of the sun. See it there on the bottom? Just an eclipse of the sun. Really? Well, in order to deny that it's from God, you have to admit a few things, don't you? You have to admit, apparently there's a Jesus guy, and apparently he was crucified, and apparently there was darkness. You're just describing it in a different way. So you had to reluctantly admit these three facts in order to make a denial about Jesus. You see how you backed in? I wasn't there doing a robbery. I was just making a deposit. You've backed in that you were there. They're backing into this. Tacitus is a very well-known historian. He says he has to back into these facts in his claim that consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, probably the resurrection, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular, just like South Orange County, right? That's where you're from. There you go. So you've got to back in to these reluctant admissions about Jesus to make this kind of a claim. These are not Christ followers. Here's a guy named Marabar Serapeon, who's a Syrian philosopher, talking to his son about several leaders. He mentions a wise king, a Jewish wise king, that the Jews actually murdered their own wise king, and after that their kingdom was abolished. He's got to back into some more facts. And here's Phlegon, who backs into two really interesting sets of facts. He says that Jesus had a knowledge of future events, but also testified that the result corresponded to his predictions. And while alive was of no assistance to himself, but that he arose after death and exhibited the marks of his punishment and showed how his hands had been pierced by nails. These guys don't believe this is true. They're just reporting the earliest accounts that they're hearing as well as non-believers. If you wonder when these accounts began, you can have certainty they were early. And these reluctant admissions, if you lost every single piece of Christian scripture and all the church fathers and all you had was the writing of these pagans, that's what you would know about Jesus. Not bad. You'd know a lot about Jesus, wouldn't you? It's corroborative. Is it everything? No, but is it touch point? Exactly what I would expect in corroborative evidence.
In addition to Jim's daily blog and weekly podcasts and videos, Jim continues to write books designed to help you become a better Christian casemaker. At coldcasechristianity.com, you'll find a link to Cold Case Christianity, a homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels, and Alive, a cold case approach to the resurrection. These resources will help you defend what you believe and share it with others. Be sure to visit the Cold Case Christianity website daily to read Jim's blog, watch the weekly video, or listen to the Cold Case Christianity podcast. You'll also find great free resources, including the free downloadable monthly Bible insert. While you're there, be sure to sign up for Jim's daily case note email. Cold Case Christianity is designed to help you become a better Christian casemaker.
Okay, so now we've talked a little bit about some of the ways we might corroborate something and verify something. Now, remember, when we talked about this, we only talked about two very limited areas of corroboration, and we talked about the limited nature of corroboration to begin with, that these are always touch point corroborations. Of course, as we go forward in technology, I think it'd be harder and harder for us to communicate this to juries. Here's what I mean by that. I think that clearly, as all of us now who own a cell phone have a pretty decent high-def camera with them at all times, that more and more we're going to see crimes are going to be captured on video in which you can have a great amount of corroboration. You can have frame-by-frame corroboration. This was never the case prior to the invention of cell phones as we know them today, smartphones. And of course, it's going to change things. It'll be great for us, evidentially, because we're going to have a lot more evidence that's going to be captured on tape. Or tape. That's an antiquated word itself. It's actually going to be recorded digitally. But the problem is going to be that there are also times, many times in fact, when you don't have this kind of corroboration. And what I fear is that as jurors see that this kind of corroboration is available, video, high def, digital, frame by frame corroboration, they're going to lose their appreciation for the kinds of corroborative evidence we have been using historically in criminal cases, which has always been touch point corroboration. Now, there's one more thing we didn't talk about in that little clip you saw, and that's that there are, in the book at least, I think 5 or 6 other additional lines of corroborative evidence that we examine. So in a talk like this, it's easy to kind of get caught up in, well, all he's got is a couple of things here, a couple of things there. Actually, it's a very rich and robust corroborative case, but there was no way for me to communicate that in the span of a 60-minute service, so you got a very small piece of it there in that tape. I did it again in that video. All right, so this kind of gives you an idea, at least, about how you might corroborate something and how much corroboration do you really need before you can be sure that something actually happened. I can tell you that I've done cases where I had much less corroboration than that, and juries were convinced, based on the robust circumstantial nature of the case, that we had the right suspect at the trial. So it's one of those things you have to kind of learn how to put the case together. We've looked at 3 things so far. We've looked at whether or not they were actually there, whether or not they can be verified or corroborated in any way, and last week also whether they've changed their story over time. Now for the last piece. Now we're going to talk about a piece that I think you'll hear this complaint offered a lot. I know I certainly hear it offered a lot, and that is the complaint that, man, I understand that you want to offer these gospels as some form of evidence, but really, why would we even looking at these gospels and treating them seriously? I mean, these are accounts of Jesus that were written by his biased friends, the friends of Jesus who, of course, wanted us to believe he was this or that, and they were buddies of his, and why would we trust anything they would write? And I think this is an objection that we hear quite a bit, and we need to be able to answer it. Why should you trust the Gospels if you know they were written by people who more than likely had a strong bias toward Jesus? They were his friends, and they want you to believe something about Jesus. I mean, I've heard people say that if they're going to believe anything about Jesus historically, it's going to have to come from an author who wasn't a Christian, from an author who wasn't part of that circle of 12, from an author who didn't have a horse in the race. Well, that's an issue we have to be able to address. It's the issue of bias, and this is a fair issue to address because in all my criminal trials, this is an area that has to be settled in the mind of jurors, or they're not going to trust the witnesses that we have called or the witnesses that the defense has called. So testing bias and prejudice is important. After all, even when we select jurors, we're careful to ask them questions that will expose their bias or prejudice so we'll know whether or not they can fairly judge the case to begin with. So let's take a look at this last aspect of eyewitness reliability, the issue of bias or prejudice, and see how we could determine whether or not the Gospels themselves are free of such bias. We'll take a look and come back, and we'll debrief the whole thing when we're all done. Are the Gospel writers lying to us because they're biased and trying to conspire? Maybe they were conspiring from the very beginning. When you work he said, she said crimes, you go to a crime scene. My son works as a patrol officer now, and he gets called out to a lot of these where a husband and wife have been beating up on each other pretty evenly. And when you get there, everyone's all injured, and they're calling paramedics, and the husband wants her arrested, and she wants him arrested. Who do I believe? How do I even know what really happened? Each person you're talking to has got a bias that's coloring the way they're telling you the testimony. I don't even know what happened here. So you got to think about what is motivating each person to give you this testimony. Can I trust it, or are they motivated by something that would cause them to lie to me? So really, bias does all come down to motive. So I'll give you a little test today. What are the 3 motives behind any homicide? By the way, they're the same 3 motives behind any crime, the same 3 motives behind any sin. There's only 3. Do you know what they are? Yell them out. I'll let you. This is a participatory part of the service. Give me one. What's the first one? Greed. Thank you. Very good. Yeah, greed is a big one. Financial greed is probably one of the chief motivators. I do a lot of murders that are motivated by financial greed. What else? What's that? Oh, we'll call this, I'll just give you a little more, I'll flesh it out a little more for you. How about sexual or relational lust? That's a big one. There's one more that's harder.
to identify. Oh, who said that? You're good. Or guilty, one of the two. Okay. Yes, here we are. It's pursuit of power. Sometimes pursuit of power is not like, a senator, trying to do, it's like a gangster is saying, he don't disrespect me in my own neighborhood, pop. It's a power issue. So this is the kind of thing we're looking for. If I'm looking at homicide, I'm looking for a person in the victim's life that's motivated by one of these three things. This is all that motivates any bad behavior, folks. It's some subcategory of these three things. So if I want to know if somebody is improperly motivated, I simply ask myself, do they have any of these three motives? By the way, Joseph Smith, I hate to step off into a controversial area, but let's talk about Joseph, the founder of Mormonism. Was he motivated in any of these three areas? Doesn't mean, by the way, if you're motivated that you're going to be a bad guy. All of us here have a motive to do something we shouldn't do, but we don't do it necessarily. We don't act on our motivations, but every bad guy I've ever worked who acted had a motivation. So my question is with the apostles, where are they motivated to do this big lie? Look at the apostles' lives and how they died. Did they ever get rich? Get girlfriends? Did they even have the power to stop their own martyrdom? Did they even have the power to control how they would die? You know how they died. I know how they died. There is no competing tradition from antiquity that describes any of these men drinking margaritas on the coast of Italy instead of dying as martyrs. Every early tradition about these men describes them in the same way. Rather than recant their testimony, rather than say that they didn't see Jesus rise from the dead, they died in a horrific way, depending on the different apostle. Now, by the way, you and I dying today for what we say is true has zero evidential value, zero, because we could die not knowing if it's true. But the person who actually saw it, who has a choice to either die for a lie or die for the truth, their death does have evidential power. You see the difference? I could fly a plane into a building today and it wouldn't prove anything. But if I was the original eyewitness, my death would have some type of evidential value.
Need a speaker for your next conference, retreat, training seminar, or church service? Jim travels around the country, making the case for the existence of God, the deity of Jesus, and the reliability of the Bible. He'd love to partner with you to create a powerful, transformational training experience. Just visit the Cold Case Christianity website and click the Book Me tab. You'll find everything you need to know there, including a list of Jim's speaking topics, promotional materials, Jim's speaking calendar, and a link to connect with our team so we can book your event. Be sure to download the free Cold Case Christianity app from the iTunes Store and the Android Marketplace. The Cold Case Christianity app puts all the resources from coldcasechristianity.com in the palm of your hand. You can read the daily blog, listen to podcasts, and watch videos from within the application. And Jim uses the app to send direct messages to fans of Cold Case Christianity. The app will also link you to all Cold Case Christianity social media and provide you with a direct connection to J. Warner Wallace. Download the app today and become a better Christian casemaker.
Well, there you have it. You've now seen between last week and this week the 4 areas that we typically investigate or examine when we're testing eyewitnesses to see if they're reliable. And by the way, we ask jurors to go through this process with those witnesses they see on the stand, but it's also not unusual for us as detectives to go through the very same process when we're looking at witnesses and trying to determine, do we have a good case? Do we have a good reason to believe this actually happened the way that she or he said it happened? We've got to examine them for bias, see if they were actually there, see if they have changed their story, if especially in these cold cases where you've got people telling the same story over the years. And finally, of course, we've got to look for other ways to corroborate whether or not this person is saying something legitimate. Now, this is the process we use all the time. And as I said in the clip from archaeology, this was the very process that I used to determine whether or not Christianity was true. But I also had a number of family members who were LDS, Latter-day Saints, Mormons, and they wanted me to examine their worldview. As a matter of fact, when they started to see me get interested in this, they kind of thought this was an opportunity to maybe talk to Jim about what they believed. And sure enough, they talked to me about those issues, and they were hoping that I would eventually become a Mormon. Now, I can tell you that that same process we just stepped through in 4 steps will do, like I said in the tape earlier about archaeology, it verifies Christianity even as it falsifies the Book of Mormon. Just not the archaeology part. All the other parts. Is there bias? Did Joseph have bias in those 3 areas I described? Did his witnesses of the golden plates, did they have any bias? Did they stand tall for what they said they believed? And did they run under pressure? Did they leave when it got inconvenient? Did they leave? Did they change their minds about this and walk away? And of course, many of them did. The same criteria, archaeology, whether or not, for example, we can date the Book of Mormon in terms of original manuscripts within any proximity of the events they claim to record. Of course, we can't. Are there changes in the Book of Mormon? Well, of course there are changes in the Book of Mormon, almost 4,000 small changes in the Book of Mormon, which is one thing if you're trying to reconstruct an original from ancient manuscripts. It's another thing if you allegedly have the original, which of course the Book of Mormon we have. We don't have the plates, but we have the very first translation from Joseph. So why in the world would we be changing it over the years? Here's my point. My point is not really to climb a hill and preach against the Mormon scripture. It's just to offer it as a comparison to Christian scripture. The reason why Christianity has continued to thrive and grow, and even in a place like in a time in history like now when it's beginning to be challenged, don't think for a second it can't withstand the challenge. And the reason why it can withstand the challenge is because it doesn't have these liabilities that we see in other worldviews when measured in this way. In fact, you can have great confidence that what we believe as Christians is true given the kinds of tests we could ever apply to any event or any record of any event in the distant past, whether it's a cold case or whether it's actually the case for Christianity. So I hope that as we go through this 4-step process, it gives you some confidence. Now, we're going to talk about lots of things on this show, and we talk about sometimes just things that are related to the culture and related to making the case for Christianity in general, but the last 2 weeks I wanted to give you just kind of something to sink your teeth into. And I've written so much more about each category, both in the book, Cold Case Christianity, but if you're just somebody who wants to stay up on a daily and weekly basis, please visit our website at coldcasechristianity.com, where I'm posting articles related to case making, related to the case for Christianity every day, either an article, a video, or a podcast. Hope to talk to you and see you here next week at Cold Case Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. It's available wherever books are sold.